grayling, of course, were always intriguing because they were the native fish, native salmonid to this region, and they had gone extinct.
Arctic grayling to me is just an easy thing for everyone to love because it's such a beautiful fish.
From a morphological standpoint, it's built differently from fish we have. From a coloration standpoint, it's different from fish we have.
They're long and slender, have a sleek shape, and their coloration is sort of unique. They're silvery, but they're iridescent, almost have a purple cast to them.
They have this huge dorsal fin that has really beautiful colorations. It's highly variable.
They're just different. The fact that they were native to this region is really the thing that makes them special.
How does a fish go from being perhaps the most abundant in Michigan waters to gone? This is the story of Michigan's Arctic grayling, and more importantly, it's the story of how to bring them back.
One of the main backbones of Michigan's fishing industry started with the grayling. There were prospectors that were coming up and looking for logging areas in the state of Michigan. And lo and behold, they found this whitefish, it was dubbed. They didn't really realize it was a grayling at that point, and it was a huge draw. So there used to be the fishing line, railroad line, and it was bringing people specifically to come and fish for grayling.
When people went stream fishing for trout species in the northern lower peninsula, it was grayling. That's what they were after, and that's what they would catch. They were the cold water species, the salmonid in the northern lower peninsula. They were targeting grayling and catching very large numbers and taking them back to the large metropolitan areas like Detroit and Chicago. It was what fishing in Michigan was in the 1800s.
Arctic grayling are native to Michigan and only one other state in the lower 48. And they were extirpated, which means they're no longer here, but as a species, they're not gone from the earth.
To actually have lost a species in the state is just, in my mind, just a huge black eye. That's something that's much harder to bring it back than it would have been if we had been working earlier, everyone, before we realized that it was lost.
Michigan has historically had a very strong conservation ethic. Unfortunately, that conservation ethic has kind of been diluted, and I feel like, especially with the involvement of the tribes, it's pulling us back to that traditional knowledge that the tribes can provide because they were here before us.
The Little River Band of Ottawa Indians has been instrumental in the effort to restore the Arctic grayling to Michigan, providing funding, research, and knowledge of what Michigan's waters were once like.
The tribes, I mean, they're going to have, whether it was verbal or they wrote it down, I mean, they have just centuries back of information that's been passed down.
Native species is a notion, an idea, and a philosophy that's just grounded in tribal resource management and conservation.
From the tribal members that I've spoken to and them talking to myself and other coworkers about their grandfathers, their grandmothers catching these fish, then learning about the decimation of this fish, that's something that is always in the back of my mind when moving forward with this project.
Their restoration to this area, to their native range, gives us a link back to that time before Michigan was changed to the point where they couldn't live here any longer.
The grayling's disappearance can be traced to a number of different factors, all of which were caused by humans.
We lost it pretty quickly. We squandered an amazing legacy of natural resources in our state, really created conditions for a total loss.
There really was no big indicator other than the catch was dwindling. Numbers were going down significantly. Certainly there were changes in habitat that people probably noticed as well, but the big thing that they noticed was that grayling just weren't there anymore.
Grayling are very sensitive to the gear, as they call it, and that means they're easy to catch, and that's a big reason to their demise.
There used to be no fishing regulations in the state of Michigan, so there was a lot of overfishing in the 1800s. We have instances reported of people blocking streams and just loading their whole boat up with Arctic grayling to either sell or use for their own consumption.
We were literally taking these fish and piling them up on banks 6 feet tall. We look at overfishing now as like taking a couple dozen too many, but I mean, they were literally taking them out. You know, you could have 6 hooks on a line and catch 6 fish at the same time.
We started putting barriers in behind them, so we started installing dams, splash dams to move logs historically, built dams to saw logs.
There wasn't a saw timber carrying tree left standing between Lake Michigan and Lake Huron.
We used to slide the timber they harvested, those logs, down into the streams to move them down to process them at the lumber mills, and that put a lot of sediment into our streams. Well, that covered up all of the beds for the Arctic Grayling, the gravel beds for them to produce.
The rivers were used as sluiceways to transport these just unbelievable amounts of timber downstream. It basically scoured those river valleys into nothing but channels.
Once the grayling started to decline because of this kind of habitat destruction from the logging and pushing logs down the river, and then this overfishing side, we introduced non-native fish.
Our native fish was grayling. You know, a lot of these fish that are hugely popular nowadays, things like brown trout, brook trout, rainbow trout, they weren't here.
Brown trout are actually from Scotland and Germany, and they came here in the late 1800s. So if you think about coevolution, brook trout and grayling, they've evolved together here. So it does make sense that they would be able to coexist well together in the streams, where brown trout weren't introduced until the late 1800s.
Brown trout are very piscivorous, in other words, they eat other fish, and they'll do it early and often.
Brown trout is like the staple of a sport fishery in this state that brings in a lot of money and resources. Anglers loved and have loved to them. But part of it is because they get big, right? We can get a trophy. So this balance of expectations of the public on what the grayling fishery is going to look like, and if that's going to conflict with a very important non-native brown trout fishery, it can get pretty divisive.
I think the reason why the people are concerned is because they've worked so hard to maintain a quality brook trout fishery, and this has involved actually physically removing brown trout from the stream, because brown trout are very aggressive. I think their concern lies with the fact that all that work may be undone by introducing another species. However, I would argue that the literature shows that grayling can coexist with brook trout, not so much brown trout.
We've kind of got to figure out where these fish will play and where streams can be managed for grayling without precluding brown trout from areas as well.
Many attempts to reintroduce grayling have failed, but the desire to reintroduce the fish remains. There's a strong indication this effort, with its emphasis on teamwork, will be different.
We have this species that we know was here 100 years, over 100 years ago, and it would just be really nice to have them back.
This got a little buzz on it and people got excited, and it was actually the Little River Band contacting the Department of Natural Resources in those talks, and they were what I would call the foundational partners of the initiative.
We did not go into this thinking we needed a lot of different people. We went into this believing and thinking that it's important to reestablish Arctic grayling in Michigan, and the interests just swelled from there.
The Michigan Arctic Grayling Initiative is truly a collaborative effort among a very diverse group of people that really want to see Arctic grayling, a native species, return to Michigan.
We're upwards of 40, 45 partners now, and its intent is to try and bring back this iconic species, the Arctic grayling, to Michigan.
This is statewide, broad level of support and interest, and because of that, we're now able to capitalize on that, and that builds momentum.
I like to joke with people and tell them that the last time that we tried this in Michigan, the Apple II computer was the thing, and I have more computing power in my pocket than what it took to land a few people on the moon. So I think we've come a long way in terms of technology and an understanding of these basic fish principles on top of the research that we've learned in the last 20, 30 years.
We've learned a lot about how to do reintroductions of species. There's new technologies that have been successful in the western United States, particularly in Montana. that uses streamside rearing opportunities. And because of that, along with better conditions in our stream systems than we've had in a long time, both from a connectivity perspective, in other words, fish can move from place to place. Grayling really like to move long distances. And from a water quality perspective, these are pretty good times. Probably the best we've had in the last 50 to 100 years.
We understand that there are dynamics with their relationship between things like brook trout and brown trout and rainbow trout. We've got to make sure that we're managing these watersheds in order to keep the appropriate species balance that we want in there, which hopefully will include grayling.
Fishing is huge. It's a multi-billion dollar, with a B, billion-dollar industry in Michigan, recreational fishing is. And the grayling is not necessarily, the grayling initiative is not necessarily focused primarily on developing a fishery where people will go out and be able to fish for them. We hope that will be the case at some point. But really it's more about bringing back a native.
It's a different process than what happened before when grayling were just willy-nilly scattered, stocked all over the place without regard to water quality.
They started doing a research, a feasibility study to see, is it possible to bring this native species back? There was headway made, and the research that they did with Michigan Tech showed that some of these systems can support this fish. From there, it really grew quickly.
We're trying to see what's their historic range. We want to reintroduce them to streams that they occurred in historically. What is the sort of physical and chemical habitat of those streams? And then sort of the third piece of it is trying to look at what is the biotic community. And by that I mean, what fish species occur in the stream? How abundant are those fish species? And do we think those fish species are going to be conducive to grayling sort of joining that community? And that's really where Nicole Watson's research comes in.
What we're really focusing on is trying to figure out what suitable fish communities grayling can survive in. But not only survive, but also thrive. So where are they going to have positive growth, and what does that overall fish community structure look like? I look at competition between age 0 brook, brown, and grayling. I look at predation rates between age 1 brook and brown trout on grayling fry. And I also look at imprinting at early life history stages, so really young, just after hatching.
We've learned some things from what's been successful in Montana, and we think that we were missing a critical imprinting period early on in the fish's development. And imprinting is that time where the fish learn for lack of a better term, the smell of the water that they were hatched. And we think that by stocking fish or rearing fish in a hatchery up to yearling size, so they're already 12 to 14 months old by the time we stock them in their receiving waters, that we were missing that key period. So once we stock them, they kind of wander looking for home. And because they were raised in a hatchery, they never imprinted on that water where they were stocked.
You got to bring them up from an egg in where they're going to be. So they have this deep evolutionary capacity that they require, to be born and raised in the place that they're going to live and survive.
A remote site incubator is a device that allows grayling to develop in the water it will live in by exposing the eggs to stream water in an environment safe for them to grow. It appears the RSIs are the missing piece for a successful reintroduction.
In Montana, they had raised grayling in the hatchery and tried to reintroduce them to some of their native areas in the state. It wasn't very successful, and then they decided to sort of, steal this idea from that what people were using, salmon researchers were using in the Pacific Northwest with these remote site incubators. And when they started using those in Montana for grayling, we're not exactly sure what the mechanism is of why they were successful, but that's when they started to have success. And that's the main reason we want to try to use them in Michigan, is to sort of see if we can mimic the success that they've had in Montana.
We're really hopeful that by putting them into the streams as eyed eggs that are just about ready to hatch, that they're going to be exposed to that water. They'll learn that chemical fingerprint, that smell, if you will, of the water, and they'll know how to home right back to that, not just that stream, but that exact gravel bed where they were hatched. And in this instance, they're not emerging from a gravel bed, they'll be emerging from the remote site incubators. We're hopeful that this is gonna be effective.
Once graylings successfully make it into the rivers and streams, they face the additional threat of competition.
We start out with predation trials where we take one predator, put it in the stream with some small grayling fry, and look at predation rates, predator avoidance, and then we transition into competition trials. And what we're finding is we do have positive growth both in the control, so just 20 grayling, and we also have positive growth of the grayling and the brook trout in the presence of each other. In the presence of brown trout, the grayling don't do so well. So we have higher mortality, so they end up being pushed out of suitable habitat, pushed away from food resources.
When reintroductions begin, the focus will be on streams with lower brown trout populations. Such stream study is vital, not just in terms of grayling reintroduction, but in the overall health of the ecosystem.
The grayling is a good bioindicator of quality because they can only live in high quality systems. The canary in the coal mine, so to speak, as far as water quality. So if you see declines in your most sensitive species, you got a problem somewhere.
This research is happening in an effort that may not have happened if it was state funded. If the grayling effort doesn't succeed, we can still use that science rather than kind of the regional specific, we don't know enough about each individual stream, so we kind of put a blanket statement over it.
It gives us more of a baseline as to what super high quality habitat looks like, feels like, smells like, even tastes like perhaps, but to have those data available for future projects is really important.
It might not be able to work everywhere, but in select streams, I definitely think it will. But if it didn't, I have already learned so much by studying this grayling in early life history, and that contribution to the scientific community is really fulfilling to me.
Exchange of information has benefited scientists involved in the project, but the reach of the grayling has grown beyond the scientific community, with interest developing in some unexpected places.
Danny Knopf is not only a renowned artist who really became passionate about the Arctic Grayling initiative and bringing Arctic Grayling back to Michigan, but she's also a writer, so she wrote several articles on this, and this is where she really became interested in the project.
That interest resulted in not just some original collaboration with some foundations and some successful fundraising, but now that's spilled over into another collaboration, which is the Ironfish Distillery, and they are very excited about using her artwork.
The land and the water around us are everything to us, and so we do everything that we can to protect those things. Once we found out about the Grayling Initiative, we did make contact and started to talk to the people who were involved, and felt that it was something that we could really get behind. And that led to us creating a couple of whiskeys that have the grayling as a prominent part of its production. When we found out that Danny Knopf had this artwork that was on, we contacted Danny and had her come out here, and we spoke with Danny, and she was all about having us use that on the label. And when you do get a chance to see the artwork on that label, you'll be astounded. As a fisherman myself, I would love to be able to go out to a stream in Michigan and fish for that wonderful fish.
Michigan without grayling was inconceivable, but now, thanks to the efforts of many, their restoration is primed for success, which is essential as it is a native species that reflects our history, heritage, and honor.
Anytime you lose a native species, you've got a less diverse ecosystem, and it's not as strong or vibrant.
I think we have a moral obligation to kind of put truth back into these natural resources.
Kind of feels like the stars are lined up this time so that we're going to be successful, and that's a cool thing to be part of.
They're a touchstone to our conservation past, or ecological past. And if we have to make room for grayling and not have so many brown trout and rainbow trout, I feel like that's a great trade-off and a necessary trade-off.
But the sky still as blue, white as before, and the stars still shine down upon us wherever we may roam. So let's cast out our nets and open every door. Let's let love guide us, let it be as we roll on down